The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of Jefferson County Courthouse as Dr. Michelle Robinson walked purposefully toward the entrance. It was 8:45 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the air held the first hints of autumn Christmas. She had chosen her outfit carefully that morning, a navy blazer over a white blouse, paired with black slacks and sensible shoes. Professional, but not flashy. The kind of outfit that should command respect, though experience had taught her that respect wasn't always given freely. As she pushed through the heavy wooden doors, the familiar scent of old paper and wood polish filled her nostrils. The courthouse lobby was already bustling with early morning activity. People lined up at the metal detectors, removing belts and emptying pockets with practiced resignation. Security guards called out instructions in bored voices, having repeated the same words countless times before. Michelle joined the line, her leather briefcase held close. Inside was a single folder containing her traffic citation and several carefully selected legal precedents she had researched. After 15 years as a constitutional law professor at State University, preparing case documentation was second nature to her. Still, she had debated whether to bring the briefcase at all. Sometimes, she knew, appearing too prepared could work against you. The security guard at the metal detector barely glanced at her ID, waving her through with the same disinterested efficiency he showed everyone else. Mitchell appreciated the neutrality of it. In her experience, it was often the small interactions that revealed the most about how people saw you. Following the signs to traffic courtroom 304, Michelle's heels clicked against the marble floors, echoing in the high-ceilinged hallway. She passed rows of wooden benches where people sat waiting, their faces showing various degrees of worry, boredom, and resignation. A young mother tried to quiet her fussy baby. Two teenagers in school uniforms whispered nervously to each other. A businessman in an expensive suit talked loudly on his phone about being late for a meeting. Michelle found an empty spot on a bench near the courtroom door. She took out her citation and reviewed it one more time, though she had memorized every detail. The ticket was for running a red light, something she knew she hadn't done. The intersection in question had a camera, but the timestamp on the citation showed a time when she had been teaching her advanced constitutional law seminar. She had proof: attendance records, classroom video footage, and witness statements from her students. As she waited, Michelle observed the proceedings through the open courtroom door. Judge William Barrett sat on the bench, his silver hair and black robes creating an imposing figure. She watched as he handled case after case, noting his patterns. He was quick with some defendants, thorough with others. The disparities in his treatment weren't obvious unless you knew what to look for, but Michelle had spent her career teaching students to notice exactly these kinds of subtle differences. A young clerk emerged from the courtroom, calling out names from a clipboard. Michelle listened as each person responded, noting how the clerk's tone shifted slightly depending on who answered. When he called Michelle Robinson, she raised her hand and said clearly, "Present." The clerk's eyes flicked over her briefly before moving on to the next name. Inside her briefcase, her phone vibrated. Probably a message from her teaching assistant about the afternoon's classes. Michelle had already arranged for a colleague to cover her lectures if the court proceedings ran long, though she hoped they wouldn't. She had a stack of papers to grade and a deadline for her latest article on judicial reform in traffic courts, an irony that wasn't lost on her. The clock on the wall ticked closer to 9:30 a.m. when the first cases would be heard. Michelle took slow, steady breaths, centering herself. In her years of teaching and practicing law, she had learned that composure was often as important as competence. Today, she would need both. Through the courtroom door, she could hear Judge Barrett's voice, stern and authoritative, as he began the morning session. Soon, he would call her case number. Michelle straightened her blazer and checked that her folder was in order. Whatever assumptions the judge might make when she walked into his courtroom, she was prepared to challenge them, not with anger or indignation, but with the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The court clerk called Michelle's case number, and she rose from her seat with deliberate grace. As she approached the front desk to file her paperwork, she could feel the weight of eyes following her movement. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Sandra, according to her nameplate, barely looked up from her computer screen. "Purpose of your visit?" Sandra asked, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Her tone carried the weary indifference of someone who had asked the same question hundreds of times that week. "I'm here to contest a traffic citation," Michelle replied, sliding her documents across the counter. She had organized everything in perfect order, the citation on top, followed by her evidence, and finally the formal request for dismissal. Sandra picked up the papers, shuffling through them with raised eyebrows. "You filled out Form TR 205, she said, sounding surprised. "Most people don't even know about that one." Her eyes darted to Michelle's face, then back to the papers, a subtle reassessment visible in her expression. "Yes," Michelle responded simply, choosing not to explain her familiarity with traffic court procedures. Years of experience had taught her that letting people reveal their own assumptions often proved more effective than confronting them directly. Sandra began entering the information into her computer, her movements becoming slightly more hurried. "Now, you do understand," she said, speaking slowly and loudly as if Michelle might have trouble comprehending, "that contesting a citation means you'll need to present evidence to the judge." Michelle nodded patiently. "Yes, I'm prepared for that." "And you know you'll be under oath," Sandra continued, her tone growing increasingly patronizing. "The judge takes these matters very seriously. If you're not absolutely sure about your case." She let the warning hang in the air. Behind Michelle, a line was forming. She could hear the shuffle of feet and the rustle of papers as other people waited their turn. A man in an expensive suit checked his watch loudly, making his impatience known. "I understand the process," Michelle said quietly but firmly. "I'm quite familiar with court procedures." Sandra paused her typing, looking up with barely concealed skepticism. "Are you represented by counsel today?" The question came with an undertone that suggested she already knew the answer and had judged it. "I'll be representing myself," Michelle replied, maintaining her composed demeanor despite the familiar sting of being underestimated. A small sound of disapproval escaped Sandra's lips. "Well," she said, reaching for a bright yellow pamphlet from a stack on her desk, "you might want to review this guide for pro se defendants. It explains basic courtroom protocol and what the judge will expect from you." Mitchell noticed how Sandra hadn't offered these pamphlets to the white defendants who had come before her. She accepted it anyway, tucking it into her briefcase without comment. The leather bag contained enough legal journals with her name on them to wallpaper the clerk's office. "Your case will be called in order," Sandra announced, stamping Michelle's papers with more force than necessary. "Make sure you're in the courtroom when your number comes up. If you miss your call, it's an automatic ruling against you and the fine doubles." As Michelle turned to leave, she heard Sandra muttering to her colleague, another one thinking she can argue with the judge. This should be interesting. Making her way back to the wooden benches, Michelle found her previous seat taken. She stood against the wall, observing as other defendants completed their paperwork. The clerk's demeanor shifted noticeably with each person, warm and helpful with some, curt and dismissive with others. The patterns were clear to anyone paying attention. Michelle opened her briefcase and retrieved her phone, sending a quick text to her teaching assistant. "Court running slow. Might need to extend coverage." Then she pulled out her copy of the traffic code, its pages marked with colored tabs, and began reviewing her notes one final time. A young law student she recognized from campus walked past, doing a double take when he saw her. His face lit up with recognition, but before he could speak, Michelle gave him a subtle shake of her head. She wanted to see how this would play out without her credentials preceding her. The minutes ticked by slowly. Through the courtroom door, Michelle could hear Judge Barrett's voice, stern and authoritative, as he processed the morning's cases. Each time the door opened, a wave of tension rolled through the waiting crowd. Everyone here had a story, Michelle reflected, and everyone deserved to have that story heard with respect and fairness. Unfortunately, she knew from both personal and professional experience that the reality often fell short of that ideal. When the bailiff finally called her case number, Michelle straightened her blazer and gathered her materials. As she walked toward the courtroom door, she held her head high, ready to face whatever assumptions awaited her on the other side. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 304 swung open with a familiar creak. Michelle stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that ran down the center aisle. The room was smaller than the lecture halls where she usually spoke, but it carried the same weighty atmosphere of authority and tradition. Judge William Barrett sat elevated behind his bench, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light. He was reviewing documents, barely glancing up as Michelle made her way to the defendant's table. From her position, she could see the slight furrow in his brow as he flipped through her case file. Case number 2023 TR 4891, the court reporter announced in a clear, practiced voice. Citation for running a red light at the intersection of Main and 4th. The judge finally looked up, his eyes settling on Michelle with the briefest flicker of surprise. He had been on the bench for 15 years, and Michelle had researched his record thoroughly. His rulings showed a pattern that any skilled statistician would find troubling. Ms. Robinson, Judge Barrett began, emphasizing the Ms. ever so slightly. You're contesting a red light violation. Do you understand that if found guilty, the fine may be increased due to court costs? Yes, Your Honor, Michelle responded, her voice steady and clear. She had taught her students about the importance of courtroom presence countless times. Now she put those lessons into practice. Very well, the judge continued, shuffling through the papers. The camera footage clearly shows a vehicle registered to you running the light at 2:15 p.m. on September 15th. How do you plead? Michelle stood straighter. Not guilty, Your Honor. I'd like to present evidence that demonstrates I couldn't have been at that intersection at the time in question. Judge Barrett's pen paused mid-note. He looked at her over his reading glasses with an expression Michelle had seen many times before, the look of someone preparing to explain something very simple to someone they assumed couldn't understand. Ms. Robinson, he said, his tone growing noticeably more condescending, the city has photographic evidence. Unless you're suggesting someone else was driving your car. He let the question hang in the air, already seeming to dismiss any defense she might offer. No, Your Honor, Michelle replied. I have documentation proving I was teaching a constitutional law seminar at State University at the exact time the violation allegedly occurred. She reached for her briefcase, but the judge held up his hand. Ms. Robinson, he interrupted, this isn't a criminal trial. We don't need elaborate explanations. The photo clearly shows. Your Honor, Michelle interjected carefully, under State Traffic Code Section 545.2, I have the right to present evidence challenging the accuracy of the citation. Additionally, precedent set in Martinez v. The courtroom had grown unusually quiet. Even the court reporter's fingers had stilled on her keyboard. Michelle could feel the eyes of everyone in the gallery on her back, including several attorneys waiting for their own cases to be called. I understand, Your Honor, Michelle said, maintaining her composure. However, I would like to note for the record that the citation contains several procedural errors that make it invalid on its face. The judge leaned forward, his patience visibly wearing thin. Ms. Robinson, I've been presiding over traffic court for 15 years. I think I know how to read a citation. His tone carried the weight of someone used to having the final word. Michelle remained standing, her posture perfect, her expression neutral. She had faced this kind of dismissive treatment before, in academia, in legal circles, even in everyday life. Each time, she met it with the same measured response. Your Honor, she began again, her voice clear and unwavering. With all due respect to your experience on the bench, I believe if you'll examine the evidence I prepared, you'll find that this case requires more than a cursory review. Judge Barrett's face reddened slightly. He glanced at the growing stack of cases waiting to be heard, then back at Michelle. It was clear he was used to defendants accepting his initial judgment, not challenging it with such persistence. Very well, he said, his tone clipped. You have 2 minutes to present your case, but I must warn you, wasting this court's time will result in additional penalties. Michelle opened her briefcase, removing her carefully prepared documents. The moment had come to reveal exactly who she was, and in doing so, challenge not just this citation, but the assumptions that had led to this confrontation in the first place. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Michelle placed her documents on the wooden podium. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on her now, the usual shuffle of papers and whispered conversations falling silent. Judge Barrett drummed his fingers impatiently on his desk, the sound echoing in the quiet room. Your Honor, Michelle began, her voice steady and clear, I'd like to start by addressing the timestamp on the traffic camera photo. She pulled out the first document from her folder, holding it up with practiced precision. Years of presenting evidence and mock trials with her students had prepared her for this moment. Ms. Robinson, Judge Barrett interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. We've already established that the camera caught your vehicle at 2:15 p.m. Unless you're suggesting the city's equipment is faulty. His tone carried a hint of mockery that made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably. Michelle remained composed, though she noticed her hands wanted to tighten into fists. Actually, Your Honor, I have here the attendance record for my advanced constitutional law seminar at State University, which shows I was teaching in Hamilton Hall at the exact time of the alleged violation. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. Your seminar? He repeated, as if the word tasted strange in his mouth. And what exactly do you teach, Ms. Robinson? Driver's education? A few nervous chuckles rippled through the courtroom. No, Your Honor, Michelle replied, her voice gaining strength. I teach constitutional law with a focus on judicial procedure and civil rights. She reached for another document, but the judge cut her off again. Ms. Robinson, he said, his voice sharp now, this court's time is valuable. If you're going to waste it with irrelevant details about your teaching job, I'll have no choice but to impose the maximum fine. A young attorney in the gallery, who Michelle recognized as a former student, stood up suddenly but thought better of it and sat back down. The tension in the room was palpable now, thick enough to cut with a knife. Furthermore, Judge Barrett continued, shuffling through his papers with growing irritation, your attempt to cite legal precedents earlier shows a dangerous little knowledge. The law is complex, Ms. Robinson. It requires years of study and practice to understand properly. It's not something you can learn from watching television shows. Michelle took a deep breath, remembering all the times she'd advised her students about maintaining composure in the face of judicial hostility. Your Honor, if I may direct your attention to the procedural requirements outlined in State Traffic Code Section 545.2. The judge's gavel came down hard, the crack making several people jump. That's enough. Ms. Robinson, I'm finding you in contempt. The fine is doubled to $500, and if you continue this disruptive behavior. Your Honor, Michelle interrupted, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Before you finish that sentence, I should inform you that I am not only familiar with Section 545.2, but I quite literally wrote the definitive law review article on it last year in the State Law Review. The courtroom fell deadly silent. Even the court reporter's fingers froze above her keyboard. Judge Barrett's face flushed red. Are you claiming to be a legal scholar, Ms. Robinson? His voice dripped with skepticism, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes now. No, Your Honor, Michelle replied, pulling out her State University faculty ID and bar card. I'm stating a fact. I am Dr. Michelle Robinson, tenured professor of constitutional law at State University Law School, and I've been a member of the State Bar for 15 years. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier. Several attorneys in the gallery were now watching with barely concealed smiles, including 3 who had taken her civil procedure course last semester. Judge Barrett stared at the credentials Michelle had placed before him, his face cycling through a range of emotions. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so suddenly that the air itself seemed to crackle with tension. In addition, Michelle continued, her voice steady and professional, I serve on the State Supreme Court's Committee for Judicial Reform, where we specifically addressed issues of bias in traffic court proceedings. She paused, letting the words sink in. Now, would Your Honor like to review my evidence regarding the citation's procedural errors, or shall we discuss the broader implications of this morning's interactions? The change in Judge Barrett's expression was like watching storm clouds part to reveal clear sky. His face, previously flushed with authority and irritation, now drained of color as he examined Michelle's credentials more carefully. The golden seal of State University caught the fluorescent light, and her bar membership card lay pristine beside it. Dr. Robinson, he said slowly, testing the proper title on his tongue. I see. His eyes darted to the gallery, where several attorneys were now watching with undisguised interest. 2 of them nodded in greeting when Michelle glanced their way. Former students who had learned the foundations of constitutional law in her classroom. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, waiting. The usual shuffle and murmur of the courtroom had gone completely still. Even the bailiff, usually stoic and uninterested, was watching the scene unfold with rapt attention. Yes, Your Honor, Michelle continued, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used in lecture halls. Now, if we could return to the matter of my traffic citation, I prepared a brief analysis of its procedural deficiencies. She pulled out a document that bore the State University Law School letterhead. Judge Barrett cleared his throat, tugging at his collar. The black robes that had seemed so imposing moments ago now appeared to weigh heavily on his shoulders. "Dr. Robinson, perhaps we should." He paused, searching for words that would help him regain his judicial composure. "Perhaps you could explain your position in more detail." A young law clerk in the corner couldn't suppress a small smile. He had attended Michelle's guest lecture on judicial bias just last semester, and now he was watching those very principles play out in real time. "Thank you, Your Honor," Michelle said, maintaining her professional demeanor. "As I was attempting to explain earlier, at the time this citation was issued, 2:15 p.m. on September 15th, I was delivering a lecture on Fourth Amendment protections to my second-year law students." She produced a class roster signed by her teaching assistant, followed by a video timestamp from the lecture hall's recording system. The judge leaned forward, examining the evidence with newfound interest. The same documents he had dismissed moments ago now seemed to command his full attention. "I see you've been quite thorough in preparing your defense, Dr. Robinson." "Yes, Your Honor. As I teach my students, proper preparation is essential to the pursuit of justice." Her words carried a weight that made several people in the gallery shift in their seats. "I also have signed statements from 3 students and another faculty member confirming my presence in Hamilton Hall during the time in question." Judge Barrett's hands, which had been so quick with the gavel earlier, now folded carefully in front of him. The power dynamic in the courtroom had shifted so dramatically that even the air felt different. "Dr. Robinson, the court appreciates your detailed presentation of the facts." From the gallery, Michelle heard a whispered conversation. "That's Professor Robinson. She wrote that paper on traffic court reform that made waves last year. The one that got cited by the state Supreme Court." "Yeah, that's her." The judge heard it too. His eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned. "Dr. Robinson, you wouldn't happen to be the author of Justice at the Intersection, Reforming Traffic Court Procedures in the Modern Age?" "Yes, Your Honor," Michelle replied, allowing herself a small smile. "In fact, that article specifically addresses the importance of giving all defendants, regardless of their background or credentials, the opportunity to present a complete defense." The irony of the situation hung heavy in the air. Judge Barrett's earlier dismissive attitude now stood in stark contrast to his current attentiveness. Several of the waiting attorneys were taking notes, likely recognizing that they were witnessing something significant. "Well," Judge Barrett said, straightening in his chair, "in light of your credentials and the evidence you presented." He paused, seemingly wrestling with what to say next. The same authority he had wielded so confidently minutes ago now appeared to have transformed into something more akin to uncertainty. Michelle stood patiently, her posture perfect, her expression professional. She had faced moments like this before, moments when assumptions crumbled and biases were exposed. The real question now was not about a traffic citation anymore. It was about what would happen next, and whether this moment would lead to any meaningful change. Judge Barrett removed his reading glasses and placed them carefully on the bench. The simple action seemed to give him time to gather his thoughts. The courtroom remained silent, waiting to see how this unexpected situation would unfold. "Dr. Robinson," he began, his tone notably different from the dismissive one he had used earlier. "The court would like to extend its sincere apologies for the misunderstanding that has occurred here today." He cleared his throat, visibly struggling to find the right words. Michelle stood at the podium, her expression neutral but attentive. Years of teaching had taught her that sometimes the most powerful lessons came from letting silence do the work. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom moving between her and the judge. "Perhaps," Judge Barrett continued, "you would be willing to present your full defense regarding the traffic citation now." He gestured to her documents, the same ones he had refused to look at just minutes ago. "The court is particularly interested in the procedural errors you mentioned." Michelle nodded and began laying out her evidence methodically. "First, Your Honor, the citation itself contains 3 significant procedural errors." She pulled out the traffic ticket and placed it under the document camera, allowing it to be displayed on the courtroom screens. "As you can see," she continued, using her professor's voice, "clear, confident, and educational, the officer's badge number is missing from Section C, making the citation incomplete under State Code 543.12. She pointed to the empty box with a steady finger. The judge leaned forward, studying the display with newfound interest. Some of the attorneys in the gallery had taken out notepads, jotting down the statute numbers she cited. They recognized a master class when they saw one. Furthermore, Michelle continued, the camera timestamp shows signs of miscalibration. According to city maintenance records, which I've obtained through a public records request, the traffic camera at Main and 4th was serviced for timing issues the week after this citation was issued. Judge Barrett's eyebrows rose slightly. The thoroughness of her preparation was impossible to ignore. You've done quite extensive research, Dr. Robinson. Yes, Your Honor. As I tell my students, justice requires attention to detail. She paused, letting the gentle reminder of her position hang in the air. The third error relates to the notice requirements under Section 545.2, which states that all photo-enforced intersections must have clear signage visible from at least 200 feet. I've included photographs showing that the required sign was obscured by overgrown tree branches at the time of the alleged violation. The judge studied each piece of evidence carefully, giving them the attention they had deserved from the beginning. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable, from dismissive authority to attentive listener. Dr. Robinson, he said finally, your presentation has been most enlightening. Not just about the citation, but about... He paused, choosing his words carefully, about certain assumptions that may have influenced these proceedings. A murmur ran through the gallery. Several of the waiting defendants sat up straighter, paying close attention to this unexpected turn of events. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing every word. In fact, Judge Barrett continued, I wonder if you might be willing to share some insights from your research on traffic court reform. Your article raised several points that, in light of today's events, seem particularly relevant. Michelle adjusted her papers thoughtfully. Your Honor, I believe the most relevant finding from my research is that justice is best served when every defendant, regardless of their background or credentials, receives a fair and thorough hearing. The weight of her words settled over the courtroom. Several people in the gallery nodded in agreement, including those still waiting for their cases to be heard. A fair and thorough hearing, Judge Barrett repeated slowly, as if testing the concept. Yes, I believe you've made that point quite effectively today. He straightened in his chair, visibly making a decision. Dr. Robinson, in light of the procedural errors you've identified, and the clear evidence showing you could not have been present at the time of the alleged violation, this court has no choice but to dismiss the citation. The moment felt bigger than a simple traffic ticket dismissal. It was an acknowledgement of something more fundamental, a recognition of bias and an opportunity for change. Mathilde gathered her documents, aware that this interaction would likely become a teaching example in her next semester's classes. The words, citation dismissed, echoed through courtroom 304, carrying more weight than the simple phrase usually held. Judge Barrett reached for his gavel but stopped midway, choosing instead to make his declaration without the formal bang that had punctuated his earlier pronouncements. Additionally, he continued, his voice carrying a new note of humility, I believe an apology is in order. Not just for the citation, but for my conduct during these proceedings. He removed his reading glasses again, a gesture that made him seem more human and less like the imposing figure who had begun this session. Michelle remained standing at the podium, her posture still perfect, but her expression softening slightly. Around her, the courtroom had grown unusually still, everyone sensing they were witnessing something rare and significant. Dr. Robinson, Judge Barrett said, looking directly at her now, your presence in my courtroom today has been educational, perhaps more so than either of us anticipated. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Would you be willing to share some thoughts on how we might improve our procedures here? Several of the attorneys in the gallery exchanged meaningful glances. They had never heard Judge Barrett invite criticism of court procedures before. The court reporter's fingers moved quickly across her keyboard, preserving every word of this unusual exchange. Michelle nodded thoughtfully. Your Honor, I would be happy to offer some suggestions. She pulled out a small notebook from her briefcase, the same one where she jotted down observations for her research. For instance, I've noticed that defendants are often interrupted before they can fully present their evidence, particularly those who appear to have limited legal knowledge. The judge's face flushed slightly, but he nodded for her to continue. In the gallery, several waiting defendants leaned forward, clearly interested in this discussion. Furthermore, Michelle continued, her teaching voice naturally emerging, the court might consider providing more detailed explanations of procedures to all defendants, not just those who appear to need them. Equal treatment should mean truly equal treatment. A young public defender in the gallery was nodding vigorously, probably remembering similar situations with his own clients. Even the bailiff, usually stone-faced, seemed to be listening intently. "These are valuable insights, Dr. Robinson," Judge Barrett said, making notes on his legal pad. "I wonder if you might be willing to—" He paused, seemingly gathering his courage. "To conduct a training session for our court staff on these issues." The request hung in the air, transforming the previous confrontation into an opportunity for genuine change. Michelle could see several court employees straightening in their seats, including Sandra, the clerk who had been so dismissive earlier. "I would be honored, Your Honor," Michelle replied. "In fact, I've developed a training program for my research on judicial reform that could be adapted for your staff." She pulled out a business card and placed it on the judge's bench. "We could focus on evidence evaluation procedures and standardized interaction protocols." Judge Barrett picked up the card, studying the State University Law School emblem with newfound respect. "I believe that would be extremely valuable, Dr. Robinson." He turned to address the full courtroom. "It seems we've all received an important lesson today about assumptions and fair treatment under the law." The gallery had grown larger as word spread through the courthouse about what was happening in courtroom 304. Several judges from other courtrooms had quietly slipped in to observe, standing at the back wall. "One final matter," Judge Barrett added, his voice carrying official weight again. "I'm ordering a review of all traffic camera citations from the intersection of Main and 4th, given the maintenance issues you've identified." He made a formal note in the court record. "Would you be willing to assist in developing the review criteria?" Michelle smiled slightly, thinking of how this case study would enrich her next semester's teaching materials. "Of course, Your Honor. Equal justice under law isn't just a phrase we carve on courthouses. It's a principle we must actively work to achieve." The judge nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in her words. "Thank you, Dr. Robinson. This court is better for your presence today." He turned to the gallery, where other defendants waited with renewed hope. "Next case, please." As Michelle gathered her materials to leave, she could feel the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. Something had changed here today, something more significant than a dismissed traffic ticket. It was a small step toward the kind of justice system she had always taught her students to strive for. 3 months after the courtroom incident, Michelle stood at the front of the Jefferson County Courthouse's main conference room. The space was packed with judges, court clerks, bailiffs, and administrative staff from every division. Even Judge Barrett sat in the front row, taking notes as Michelle presented the final session of her court reform training program. "And so," Michelle said, clicking to her last slide, "when we examine the data from the past quarter, we can see significant improvements in defendant satisfaction and case outcomes." She gestured to a graph showing rising approval ratings and fewer appeals. The numbers told a clear story of positive change. Sandra, the clerk who had once handed Michelle a basic court procedures pamphlet, raised her hand. She had become one of the most engaged participants in these training sessions. "Dr. Robinson, could you tell us more about the new intake procedures you've helped develop? They've made such a difference in how we interact with defendants." Michelle smiled, remembering their first interaction months ago. "The key was standardizing our approach," she explained. "Every person who walks through those courthouse doors deserves the same level of respect and attention, regardless of their appearance, education level, or background." From his seat, Judge Barrett nodded in agreement. The past 3 months had transformed him from a skeptic to one of the program's strongest supporters. He had even started mentoring other judges on bias awareness, sharing his own story as a teaching tool. "Next week," Michelle continued, "we'll be presenting our results to the State Judicial Conference. Several other counties have expressed interest in implementing similar programs." She closed her laptop as applause filled the room. What had started as a confrontation over a traffic ticket had grown into something much larger. After the session, Michelle walked through the courthouse hallways, noticing the changes that had taken place. New signs clearly explained court procedures in multiple languages. Information kiosks offered assistance to those who needed it. The whole atmosphere felt more welcoming. "Dr. Robinson," a voice called out. She turned to see Thomas, a young law student who had witnessed her original court appearance. He was now interning with the court's administrative office. "I just wanted to thank you. Your experience here inspired my thesis topic on judicial reform." Michelle paused to chat with him, remembering how many teaching moments had come from that day. Her advanced constitutional law class had spent an entire week analyzing the incident, examining everything from implicit bias to procedural justice. Later that afternoon, Michelle sat in her university office, reviewing emails from other courts interested in her training program. On her wall hung a framed copy of her latest law review article, "From Confrontation to Transformation: Reforming Court Culture Through Educational Intervention." Judge Barrett had written the foreword, candidly sharing his own journey of recognition and change. A knock at her door interrupted her work. A group of her students stood there, excitement on their faces. "Professor Robinson," one said, "we just heard that the state Supreme Court cited your traffic court reforms in their latest opinion." Michelle opened the court's website, and there it was. The justices had used her research and the Jefferson County program as an example of how local courts could address systemic bias and improve access to justice. She felt a wave of satisfaction, knowing that the impact would reach far beyond one courthouse. Her phone buzzed with a message from Judge Barrett. "You'll be pleased to know that out of 500 reviewed traffic camera citations, we found 127 with similar procedural errors. All dismissed. Real change happening here, thanks to you." Michelle smiled as she typed her reply. She thought about how a simple traffic ticket had opened the door to meaningful reform. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest moments of standing up for what was right. As the afternoon sun streamed through her office window, Michelle turned to her computer to work on her next project, a comprehensive guide for courts nationwide on implementing bias awareness training. On her desk sat a small plaque recently given to her by the courthouse staff. It read, "To Dr. Michelle Robinson, who taught us that true justice begins with seeing each person clearly." The traffic ticket that had started it all was framed on her wall, a reminder that change often came from unexpected places. It had become a powerful teaching tool, showing her students that their legal education wasn't just about learning laws. It was about using that knowledge to make the justice system work better for everyone.